who will share some of her research on that issue.
Thanks very much. And thank you for the opportunity to speak about this research project, which started in 2009 from a conversation with Rafe Matthews about his research for his most recent doctorate. He was aware of the need to record the memories of people while they were still alive and cogent. We agreed immediately that the research would be related to Race's work but would not be linked to it, not linked in directly. So we drew up a bit of a list of possible people, and I started to formulate the research questions with a view to getting a research grant. Having a research grant from CTC was important as it gave institutional cover when recruiting informants. I could tell informants that what they said was going on the record, and that the oral archive would be housed in the Melbourne College of Divinity Research Repository. Not easy to say that. I was interested in recording the voices of those who remembered the heyday of Catholic action in Australia, and which was expressed in a whole range of organisations, including the YCW, but also the Campion Society, the Catholic Worker, the National Catholic Rural Movement, the Newman Society, and some others. I wanted those interviewed to describe the sources of their own or their parents' ideas, the organisations they were part of, including their activities, formation and education, and the legacies of that period for the Church and for the Society. I interviewed 11 people between March 2009 and November 2010. While many of those interviewed mentioned the YCW, 4 of them focused strongly on it. 2 spoke of their own involvement, namely Kevin Peoples and Jim Ross. The accounts that they gave show something of the extraordinary influence that the YCW had on their subsequent lives and on their activities. We are fortunate indeed that Kevin Peoples has published his memoir, which makes palpable the excitement and the special nature of formation that he received through the gospel discussions, and especially through the inquiry method, which shaped his thinking over his lifetime. As he said, it was heady stuff. You can buy the book. Sounds some. Jim Ross described the key part that he played in developing and expanding the reach of the YCW. As a paid organiser, he operated at the highest levels of the YCW and shaped the methods and processes that he describes in educating young workers, in conscientising them in the Paulo Freire tradition. He outlines the initial 12-week training program for new groups, which introduced them to the YCW and set out the framework. Meetings were based on a gospel reflection, a census when they identified other young people and tried to make contact with them, items of interest, which was an attempt to continue to explore the reality of their lives and what was happening, and the facts of action, where people had taken action and the group reflected on that. Jim Ross sees the inquiry method as a process undertaken every week, which became automatic over time. He describes it as a formalised campaign based around themes, to look at the situation in their daily lives, to reflect on that in the light of Christian social principles, and then to decide how to address the contradiction between that reality and the experience of those principles. I understand that he is preparing a memoir which will add greatly to our understanding and to the literature in this area. Both interviewees spoke of the importance of the priest's influence in the work of the YCW, and the other 2 people in my research sample discussed the YCW from their perspectives as priests. Father Cyril Halley recalled the importance of Father Charlie Mayne, SJ, and visiting YCW leaders, including Ted Long, Father Lombard and Father Charlie McCann, in his own seminary formation. He said that he supported the YCW because he judged that the development of young men in 2 years in the YCW was more effective than the formation of seminarians in 7 years. He describes his contacts with the international leadership of the YCW and the significance of it as a lay movement in a clerical church. John Maloney recalled his life as a priest and his involvement with the YCW as the young curate in Ballarat. Again, he dwelt on the importance of the lay leadership and the stifling effects of clericism. His several volumes of memoirs amplify those views. The above interviews give some substance to the question of why the YCW flourished, though they are all very serious accounts. There is little mention of the importance of the football competition, the social life, including the dances, which were a happy dating ground, and the means that meetings and other activities offered as an escape from parental supervision. Why did the YCW die away? All these informants speak of church factors, the changes that the Second Vatican Council brought to the church, and how the parish became central to the work of the Pilgrim Church, thereby downgrading special ministries. Jim Ross noted it had a strange impact, because while the council endorsed the things that the YCW and other groups had been saying for 20 years, the Catholic action movements all died away rapidly thereafter. Not mentioned, but important, is the fact that many of the inspiring young priests left the priesthood and no longer assisted in the development of such groups. And also I noticed recently Bob Dixon saying in the paper that church-going peaked in 1954, and it's easy for us to see church numbers having dropped away, but those who attend church, regularly dropped away. But it was always highly problematic and maybe reached a high point at the time we're talking about. But like Max Vidola, I would like to see some research which examines economic and social factors in the decline of the YCW and the loss to the church that entailed. And I'll just sketch a few thoughts here. Members of the YCW were young, very young, and changes in the labour market and in education affected this group disproportionately. While full-time employment of young people in entry-level jobs had been declining since the Second World War in Australia, by 1970, structural changes in the labour market and the elimination of largely entry-level jobs meant that the nature and number of young workers had changed significantly. After nearly full employment during the post-war years, youth unemployment preoccupied policymakers. It was a major election issue in the early 1970s, when the unemployment rate for 15 to 19-year-olds was 25%. During the immediate post-war period, most young people left school at year 10 to go to full-time work, including apprenticeship. Increasingly though, young people combined working part-time and schooling. By 1981, 1/5 of young people were part-time workers and in school. Participation in education became a policy goal during the same period. During the immediate post-war period, most young people who left school at year 10, aged about 15, had entered full-time work. By the 1970s, most 16-year-olds were in school and completing year 11. In 1970, the upper secondary curriculum was directed at the small proportion of young people who continued straight on to university. But that greater diversity of curriculum and alternative credentials that we see now were becoming established. By 1983, when the Blackburn Report wrote its first Working Party report, the policy goal was to make schools and TAFE attractive to the great proportion of 15 to 19-year-olds. So extended education rather than early entry to work was the preferred policy goal. The extended dependency of young people, their primary identification as students rather than as workers, and their instrumental attachment to labour markets via part-time work, all point to the drying up of the market that was tapped by the YCW. Why the YCS did not step into this space is a matter of potential research, of course, too. I turn now to applaud the intention of the organisers to record the testimonies of those who are keepers of the memory of these days. The informants that I had the pleasure of meeting were willing, and many were enthusiastic participants in the recording of their stories. And I found the following to be helpful, and I have 10 commandments. First, clearly establishing the time, place and expectations of the interview. Arrive on time with reliable, familiar recording equipment. Secondly, before you go, become as fully informed as you can about the purpose you are going to interview, the person you are going to interview. Third, reiterate the purpose of the interview and reconfirm permission for this interview to form part of the research project. That's important because otherwise you won't get it lodged anywhere, much less accessed. Fourth, open the interview by identifying the person, place and date, and move to a general question which opens up the terrain. For example, what can you tell me about your early days in the YCW? Have a schedule of questions and ensure that the major points are covered, but listen attentively to any new leads and follow them up. Sixth, allow the interviewee to reflect and think out answers and let them find the word rather than prompt. And seventh, and very important, keep your opinions to yourself. Your job is to get the interviewee to open up to you and not the reverse. Eighth, accept that the interviewee's definition of reality and the historical record might differ. This is a record of what the interviewee can remember. Ninth, thank the interviewee with a letter in the following week. And 10, send a copy of the interview and the transcript, if any, to the interviewee for any corrections, emendations or elaborations. Thank you.